fictional thing. The more I got into it, I had a theory of the case, and I thought I got to do this as nonfiction. It's just not been done. No one has really paid attention to this person, and I want to do it justice.
Welcome to our latest episode of Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Doug Brunt, and we're going to be talking about his first work of nonfiction, The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I, which was an instant New York Times bestseller. And when we talk about it, you're going to see why. Yesterday, Apple Books selected Diesel as one of the 20 best books of 2023, which is huge. Fabulous accolade. And it was also named one of the best history books of the year by Audible. So two great pieces of praise going into the end of the year. In our book reporter review, Lorraine Shanley said, readers are treated to a rich saga filled with physics, engineering, and mechanics, as well as a social history of Europe and America at the turn of the century. And I'm going to be sharing some of Lorraine's questions in this interview. Doug is also the host of a podcast called Dedicated with Doug Brunt, where he interviews authors. I want to hear more about this. And he also mixes up their favorite cocktails. Somewhere I have, let me see. This is the bottle of tequila from our 10th anniversary party, and we're not going to finish it until we close the company. So I have this bottle, and it really is still sitting here right next to my desk. So I've enjoyed many of those episodes. I've watched many to see how he interviews authors and his take on things, which I always enjoy. And we're going to talk more about that later. And with that intro, welcome, Doug. So good to see you.
Carol, thanks so much for having me. This is great.
So let's start at the beginning. What drew you to write about Diesel? Where did this idea come from?
Well, that is an interesting personal story because, 7, 8 years ago, like most of your listeners and viewers, I didn't know there was a Rudolf Diesel. I had passed the word diesel all the time. I see it at the fueling station, on a train, on a boat, whatever. But I didn't know there was a person. In fact, I didn't even really know it was a different engine. But I bought a boat about 8 years ago, and it was this older boat. It was a little bigger. It needed to be fixed up. And I was talking to the guy at the boatyard, asking what I should do to fix it up. And he said, well, the first thing you should do is get rid of these old gasoline engines and put in diesels. And I said, why? I don't understand why. I thought one engine was like any other engine. He said, no, diesel is a fundamentally different engine. 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines, none from diesel. You can take a lit match, drop it into a barrel of diesel fuel, nothing will happen. There are no fumes. It doesn't even have spark ignition. It's a compression engine. So fundamentally different. Plus, you get 3 to 4 times the fuel efficiency. So on a 200-gallon tank of fuel, you go 3 or 4 times as far. So I repowered to diesels. And then, as you know, in the past, I've been a novelist. And so I was kicking around the internet looking for ideas that could spark an idea for a new book. And I came across this list of mysterious disappearances at sea. And down the list was Rudolf Diesel. And I thought, wow, I wonder if that has anything to do with these diesel engines I just bought. And of course it does. And so it was this mysterious disappearance in 1913, just before World War I. And I can explain the disappearance quickly, which sort of sets up the mystery, because the book really, it's a biography. As you say, it's sort of a primer on European diplomacy, turn of the century, but it's also like an Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes kind of mystery. So September 29, 1913, Rudolf Diesel is traveling from Belgium to Great Britain across the North Sea on an overnight passenger ferry. And at this time, he's a huge celebrity. History has really forgotten the man. He's been deliberately paved over for reasons you learn in the book. But at the time, he was like an Elon Musk or Richard Branson kind of figure. And so he's traveling on the overnight passenger ferry, and in the night, he disappears. He's supposed to meet his traveling companions for breakfast at 6 a.m. He doesn't show up. They hold the ship at sea and they do a search. All they find are his hat and his coat neatly folded by the stern of the ship, by the rail on the promenade deck, seeming to mark where he might have jumped over. And so they can't find him. They pull into port in Great Britain. Newspapers immediately go wild. I mean, he really was a huge figure at that time. So it was the cover of the New York Times, cover of the papers in London, Western Europe, all the way out to Moscow. And the presumption early is suicide. Mm-hmm. But there are also 2 theories of murder. One was that he might have been murdered at the orders of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany. The other that he might have been murdered at the behest of Rockefeller or Big Oil Trust, because he presented an existential threat to both of those figures. Mm-hmm. which I can say now what the threat is, which if you want, I won't give away the book. I usually stop short at saying it wasn't suicide.
Yeah.
But in terms of the investigation, why he presented a threat, why the diesel engine was such a big thing at that time and has been to the present day, is a fascinating part of the book. And we can get into why he's a threat to those two, if you want.
I definitely want to get this. When I pulled up a gas station, I was just like you. I see diesel fuel, and I have, oh, it's just another kind of fuel. I had no idea it should be with a capital D because it's someone's name, and I didn't know it was a grade of gasoline, and I did not know it was not flammable. So there are things that just at the beginning, I'm like, wow, I didn't even know these things, were going on. What was it like? Lorraine's asking this, to take on such a demanding topic that required so much research for your first nonfiction book.
That was scary. And I know you've said you've read a lot of historical fiction. People like Fiona Davis does terrific historical fiction. And in the beginning, I was thinking, well, maybe I'll do this as historical fiction because there was so little written about the man in the English language in particular. It's a very small entry in Encyclopedia Britannica, which basically just says suicide and he did these things. And the more I got into it, the theory of suicide made no sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, I'll write it. I've got the scaffolding of a story, and there's no dialogue, but I'll make up the dialogue, and I'll just sort of write this as a fictional thing. The more I got into it, I had a theory of the case, and I thought I got to do this as nonfiction. It's just not been done. No one has really paid attention to this person, and I want to do it justice. There are a couple of older, more academic biographies of him. One from the '60s, one from the '80s. Both presume suicide, by the way, which is not correct. And so I just took it on, but the research was super fun, but it was intense. It was during COVID, so a lot of times I couldn't get into the archive. Sometimes the archivists couldn't get into their own archive, but eventually they could, and they would help me and scan things and send them. Contacted the German professor from my high school, who translated reams of material from German to English for me, all these diaries and historical documents and letters and business things. And so that was fun. And every once in a while, the book is really about drawing connections between these figures. I mean, it's an incredible cast of characters in that book. That quarter century before World War I, it's got Churchill and Edison, and Adolphus Busch plays a major role in this book, the founder of Anheuser-Busch. And when you draw these connections, there'd be little things that would be meaningful to me. Understanding the Diesel story, something that Churchill did on this date might have been a minor thing for someone else, but for me, it was a huge revelation. Yeah. And when I had those moments in the research, it was like the geeky side of Indiana Jones. You're like, oh my gosh, I found gold here. So I in the end, I really enjoyed the research, but it was about 4 years.
4 years of doing that. I read a lot more fiction than nonfiction. My husband's the nonfiction reader in our house. Can tell you anything about Grant, can tell you anything about any of these wars. It's like really crazy. He gave the book a thumbs up, and I've read a lot of historical fiction about the royals in Europe. And here, the narrative nonfiction, the way you treated this, you gave readers a deep dive into what's happening in Europe at the time. So that is completely set up as well. Like Victoria, what she's doing, what's happening at the world at large, but mostly Europe. And what I really loved is that you could see the relationship between England and Germany. You could see where things were happening, and you also see how they could go awry badly later on. How did you balance the background with telling Diesel's story? Like, you've got all this really great information in. When do you sit there and go, okay, I've got enough? Or was that like the editor's chance to say, okay, we got too much here, too much there?
Yeah, I wrestled with that a lot, even before my editor. And then my editor, Peter Borland, he runs Atria Books at Simon & Schuster, is terrific. And so that was something we had many conversations about, because the thrust of the story, of course, is Diesel. But the way the mystery is set up, we've got these two murder suspects, and we've got other characters. So it does toggle between setting the stage of this period of time, which I jokingly refer to as Downton Abbey, the early seasons. It's that period of years just before World War I, when Europe really lived in a different way. And there were monarchies all over the place that then collapsed at the end of, think about the number of monarchies that collapsed after World War I. It was the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all gone after World War I. So I wanted to evoke that period of time, which was fun and a challenge. But you're right, you can't go on forever. I got to get back to Diesel at some point. Right. So I tried to do what was critical for pushing the story forward and for achieving the aim to evoke the period that he was in, his Diesel's time. Because I could have gone on forever. There are, if you look at the floor around here, there are hundreds of pages that are on the floor. And there are, I don't know how many footnotes are in the book, a lot.
What?
but there were 4 times as many before. And I wanted to make it so that each footnote is like a little treasure. It's like a little present you want to unwrap at the bottom of the page. That because it's a pain. I understand that you're reading lines like, oh my god, another footnote. I've got to go down to the bottom of the page and then back up. Nobody enjoys that experience. But I wanted to make it good enough. You're like, ooh, another footnote. I get to go down and read this cool little thing. So I hope I achieved that. I've had feedback that I have. So I hope
No, you
we'll see. But
definitely.
yeah, a lot of editing. And my editor Peter Borland, I got to say one more time, was really a great work on this.
He really, really, really is terrific. And I've known him for years, and he's just subtle about the way he does things. He's just subtle of, I just don't think so. I think we need to move this. And you realize that a lot of thought has got into that. I think we need to move. Like he's thought about it for days, move this, move that, and how to present it to the author as well. So that we're going to move this, but it's still all good. It's still all good.
Right. We're not going to feel horrible about it. Yeah.
No, and I agree about the footnotes. I like seeing those because it was a little bit more of the story. It was a little bit more of, this is what you want to know. This is what you need to know. I was also watching Gilded Age at the same time, and you were realizing these are all these very wealthy people with the estates and this and that. And it was before taxes. Let's just say that. It was before taxes. There was a lot of money running around, and it was really, really crazy. So, okay, if you want to persuade fans of your novels, people who've read your novels before, that this book is going to appeal to them, what's the pitch? What's the pitch of, you've read novels by me, it's my still writing style? What is it?
It's the writing styles there. I mean, this is an incredible piece of history. I've been referring to it as the iceberg theory of history. Hemingway has his iceberg theory. I apply that to history in that this is a setting in which most of the characters and most of the scenes and events. Like you'll have some hook into that. And then I'm going to blow your mind. You won't believe the other side of some of these characters, the other side of those events, or what that event meant for this event, what it means for how we live today. There are so many things that resonate today. Like, for example, we can get into Rockefeller's challenged relationship with Diesel. But for example, this is one of the footnotes. It really wasn't a set thing 120 years ago that gasoline would be our fuel for all these things. Mm-hmm. People look around like Elon Musk and the electric car. In 1905, New York City had a fleet of hundreds of taxi cabs. They were all electric, and there was a charging station on Broadway in Times Square to charge these cars. So it's not some newfangled thing that Musk has come up with. This was there, but Rockefeller resisted it. He wasn't looking for electric cars. He was looking to sell gasoline in combustion engines. And, just to get into it briefly here, the reason diesel presented an existential threat to Rockefeller's, he developed this new combustion engine, the diesel engine, which was entirely flexible with regard to fuel. He won the 1900 Paris World's Fair with a diesel engine running peanut oil. Mm-hmm. He could run vegetable oil, peanut oil, coal tar, a number of things, all stable at room temperature, not flammable. And he didn't need gasoline. So he was on a 1912 trip through America, and he said, I can break the American fuel monopoly, and I don't need a law to do it. I don't need the Sherman Antitrust Act. I can do it with the power of my technology. And if you have farmers, you can grow your own fuel. Every nation with any agriculture can have fuel independence. And then even just 15 years ago, Willie Nelson is sort of echoing this same thing that Rudolf Diesel said. He was driving his tour bus around America for his concerts about 15 years ago. The bus, of course, anything larger than a passenger car to this day is diesel. And he was running his diesel tour bus on recycled kitchen grease, basically vegetable oil, which is what Rudolph was doing 120 years ago.
I was trying to figure out, was he getting donations along the way? Hi, come to the concert and bring some kitchen grease with you as you arrive. Your ticket is a gallon of kitchen grease. I remember seeing that and just saying, how? But we've always just been trained. And it goes back to the big oil days of, this is the way you do it. This is the way. And other things are tried. And I'm going to get into, Diesel made 3 predictions. And I really loved this. I'm going to read it because I will not remember all this. Pollution largely ignored in industrial nations would become an important consideration in engine design. Second, despite diesel coming later to America, he felt they would use more diesel-powered locomotives than anywhere in the world. And third, while America was presently monstrously rich in its domestic supplies of fuels, eventually economic efficiencies would transcend wasteful habit. Now, when you came along these things, these are all prescient about what ends up happening. Were these like aha moments of, wow, he was a big thinker besides just being an engineer?
He really was, and he did have that ability to see around corners. And in those days, and to these days too, but the engineers and innovators then felt they had an obligation to have a dual role as a social theorist, to think through how their innovations can be applied to society and to better society. And this sort of gets into the Kaiser thing, where I'm going with this. Why Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany viewed him as a threat, because there's this term called technical sweetness, and it refers to the feeling of euphoria and excitement that an inventor can feel when the invention is moving forward, and that feeling of euphoria can overwhelm any sense of caution of should this move forward or not. And the classic example of technical sweetness is Oppenheimer with the bomb. Mm-hmm. And we hear it a lot today with software engineers and AI, artificial intelligence. But it applied to Diesel as well before all of them, because by 1913, the diesel engine had emerged as the only power source, the only engine that could power a submarine or a U-boat. And the U-boat was just emerging as a thing. I mean, the submarine technology was just really emerging at that time. The torpedo was invented in like 1907 or 8. But they didn't have an engine that could power it. So really, it was kind of a useless thing. It could barely make it out of the harbor. Gasoline and kerosene engines didn't work because they were spark ignition with fumes. There was no fuel efficiency. So you couldn't go very far. And even if you could, you probably blew up or choked out from gas fumes. But with diesel, it could go long ranges out to control sea lanes. It was stable fuel. So in order to have a sub fleet, you needed diesel engines. But Rudolf was still really the main expert in developing engines for undersea use. And this, as you pointed out, there was that German-Anglo rivalry. There was the middle of the German-Anglo naval arms race. In general, it was a period of militarism and nationalism that sort of ushered us into World War I. So the Navy of every major power was scrambling for diesel expertise to build a submarine fleet. And Diesel was at the center of all of that. And when he was traveling across the North Sea on that day in September 1913, he was going to Great Britain because he was the co-founder and board director of a new diesel engine manufacturing company in Great Britain, whose mandate it was to build diesels for the Royal Navy submarine fleet. So you can imagine the Kaiser was like, hell no, which is why there was speculation that he might have murdered Diesel. He didn't want him helping his arch enemy that was only a few hundred miles across the North Sea.
Yeah, and you think about, okay, Europe, you think about England over here, you think about Germany, and then you're like, oh, wait, there's that way to go back and forth before we flew. There was something other way, and you don't really think about it because you're like, oh, you have to go through all these countries. No, this is what he was doing at that time. I think that when Ray was sharing, you covered so much ground exploring technological, economic, social, political issues in the 20th century. But you deal with Diesel's efforts to create and improve at a different level with exhaustive and technically complex, explanations to us. What was because of your interest in the subject, or did you want to really establish this is the significance of what's going on? Because it was so big at the time, because it was so different from anything else we were doing. I mean, there's still horses at this time. Let's get real. Yeah. There's horses and carriages and dirt streets.
Yeah, and trains are, the steam engine that powers locomotives in the early days. Like, that's why we don't have any forests in America anymore. In the early days, we were just throwing wood, and the way the steam engine works. So this is a great question, because I wanted to convey why diesel was different from technologies of the day. But I wanted to do it in a simple way. This doesn't want to be some engineering book, and it doesn't have to be. So, for example, I try to evoke things that people immediately recognize. So the way I explain the steam engine in the book is I take you to the movie Titanic. And everyone knows that scene where the captain's out there like, let's stretch our legs, boys. And the camera pans down into the engine room where there are dozens and dozens of huge guys with sweaty backs shoveling coal into a furnace. And the technology of the steam engine is basically like boiling water on a stove. That's all it is. You take coal, you shovel it in this orange, fiery hot furnace. That is heating a big boiler, a big pot of water. Then that water turns to steam. That steam pressure moves the gears of the engine. That's the steam engine, plus a whole chimney apparatus that releases pillars of black smog and partially burnt particles of coal into the atmosphere, like horribly inefficient and smoggy and gross. But that's steam technology, and those are the engines. They're huge, they're bulky. You couldn't possibly have this on a car. It's way too big and heavy. So it works for things that can support the weight, like a train or a ship, or it's stationary. It's in a big manufacturing plant, on the ground. It's not going anywhere. So diesel came along and he could do that in a much more compact way. You didn't have to shovel coal into a furnace. It was internal combustion. It's a high pressure engine. You introduce the fuel into the cylinder, it explodes. The fuel is drawn down automatically, liquid fuel from a tank. So there's no, these ships used to have rooms full of coal that people would then carry and shovel into the ship. And so, but diesel was a high torque, high power engine that could kind of do the job of those big, heavy loads, but do it in a way that looked a little bit more like the rinky-dink gasoline engine. So it was kind of the best of both worlds. And anyway, when I explain these technical differences, I use devices like, remember that ship in the movie Titanic? Like, that's what the steam engine looked like, and that's how it works. So I think I deliver it in a way you can be like, oh, I get it. Yeah, I'm no engineer, because I'm no engineer either. And my test case was my wife. If she could read it, like, oh, I get it now. Totally, that's easy. Like in one paragraph, I kind of, for the first time in my life, I get it.
And my husband is an engineer. So you can just imagine me sitting there going, oh, I think we can have a conversation about this now. Because it's kind of thing where, like, even carving the turkey, he comes up with, well, let's do it like this. And I'm always doing things. And he's like, there's a better way. And my younger son has that same brain. And I'll just sit there and go, here, could you just go do this? It's going to be much easier if you do it. Like, let's not discuss this anymore.
Yeah.
Because you are going to go in your brain and come up with a different way to do it, including, this is just one aside, in his room, he had the whole thing hooked up to like Google, like, everything with the lights, the TV. So I went in his room one day, it was dark and I couldn't get in. I called him and I said, what do I do? He goes, just say, okay, Google. So I say that and everything turns on. And you think about years ago, you never would have done something like that. So it's all these innovations that are made along the way that people do. But you've really introduced, look what back here was going on that was so big. Like, we think technology is big right now. Think about getting from point A to point B without shoveling the coal with the sweaty guys on the ship. It was always the sweaty guys on the ship. They were always the ones that were going to die because they weren't ever going to come out of there, and that's where it was going to flood. Am I right? On, like, ships going down?
That's right. That's right. And of course, when you think about merchant marines, that's 100 fewer people you need on the ship, who are taking up space to sleep, who are taking up food to eat, never mind all the coal, the rooms full of coal. So if you're shipping, it's all of a sudden your capacity to actually deliver cargo, all the ratios of sort of cargo to expense just dramatically changed. So diesel completely revolutionized commercial shipping. To this day, 100% of cargo ships on the oceans, they're all diesel. They've tried a nuclear powered cargo ship. It doesn't really work. Everything out there doing cargo all these years later is diesel. He's completely developed our global economy.
Yeah, what ends up happening? He also declined offers to work for Pennsylvania Railroad as well as Henry Ford. Good offers, good perks, and he headed back to Europe. Did he give you thought to how he might have changed those companies? Like, if he had stayed and done something with Ford or done something with the railroad?
That is interesting. I think, it was a bit of time before the metal casting and the metallurgy technology got to the point where you could make a diesel engine light enough to work for a passenger car. That was a little bit away. And that was just, there were some impediments to what he was doing. And of course, you go back to the steam age, this is, like the James Watt days of the 1770s, when the first steam engine came out. The metal casting was so poor then, they were sealing things with rope and leather, and you can imagine how much pressure is lost in those situations. By the time diesel came around in the 1890s and early 1900s, metal casting was strong enough to sort of support what he was doing, but it was a much heavier engine than the light, sort of light gasoline ones. But I think one of the things that could have happened is, if we had followed his vision, like, he really didn't want to use petroleum. To this day, as much as Willie Nelson was doing his kitchen grease thing, most diesel fuel is petrol diesel. It's still a derivative of rock oil, crude oil. Diesel didn't want that. He was, he either used coal tar, which you get from coal. As you go through the coking process with coal, you get coke, coal gas, and coal tar, which is like a black sludge that is a great diesel fuel, or vegetable oil or nut oil. And if we had followed that path, I wonder if we would have had a cleaner century, and certainly a century with fewer wars over the Middle East and where petroleum is in the ground.
Exactly. Because you're thinking about what's going on. Rockefeller had this huge impact on the energy world with his paper wealth and is wanting to control everything. At the petroleum market, the global events, everything happening go to Standard Oil. But he had zero interest in anything that Diesel was coming up with. He didn't even want to hear, well, maybe I could be part of that. Maybe I could do something with that. It was just, He didn't want to bail out Great Britain or Europe. He didn't want to do anything. It was like single-mindedly, my wealth, me moving forward, maybe my family as well. And I always think about now, after reading this, what the world could have been like. It could have been so different. And you think about how we could rewrite history if certain people hadn't done certain things. It's
Yeah,
it's just,
that sort of sliding doors exercise is always so interesting to do.
yeah, like what could have happened, what would have happened. You know, as you explore the death of Diesel, the book takes on this pace and tone to me like a thriller. It really does. It's got this pacing to it of, it could be this, it could be that. And then you realize you're still got this much more in the book to read. You've got a good chunk of where we're going to explore this. Was it something that you planned, the pacing that happened there, or did it happen as you started writing and editing later on?
That was early on, that sort of like Dateline, and you go through that section, and then you sort of review the elements of the case. Yeah, I had always envisioned it being that way. Of like, now we're getting in there, and it's like boom, 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 as the facts come rolling out, because that's how I read it. You know, one of the great things about doing the research on this in this era, as opposed to say 60 years ago, or even 30 or 20 years ago, the ability to access newspapers around the world. You know, so much of this stuff is scanned, and more is scanned every day. So if I wanted to find out what happened in October of 1913 in Berlin, London, New York, Moscow, it would be very hard to do. You'd have to go find cabinets of dusty, old, crumbly papers in all of these cities. Now most of that stuff is scanned. So some require a subscription, some don't. But you can go onto newspaper archives that are scanned and available online. So what I would call just library research, sitting at my desk, I can do a lot of this stuff. And so I was following sort of the world's coverage of the event in the weeks after his disappearance. And it was just phenomenal as I went day by day, sort of resurfacing things that are publicly available. I mean, it wasn't like I found some hidden thing. But there's the contradictions, the witness testimony that popped up in different papers. It was just fascinating, and it rolled off to me. So the way I experienced it was that same like Dateline. Here's what happened in October. It's Dateline, October 3rd. Dateline, October 5th. I'm just like, oh my god, I can't believe this.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to deliver it in the way that I experienced it.
And you know what's really interesting too is so much of the news these days to me is delivered. It's like this. This is the news. And if you go to any channel, you're hearing it kind of like the same way. There, you're getting. This is what they said in Europe. And there were writers, there was journalism. There was not just journalism, there was writing that went into this. And it was craft of writing. And I'm not saying that happens all over the place right now, but it happens a lot, that you just feel like you're reading the same press release you saw someplace else. And instead, you're seeing the different tones of way it took on around the world, like how they're feeling about it as opposed to these people. And also the conjectures of what happened. Like, where did he really just jump off the boat? Didn't make sense with everything else that had happened that night. Didn't make sense.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there looking, going, okay, here we go. Did you debate, and this is from Lorraine, with yourself or with your editor, how much focus to put on the mysterious disappearance and how you would lay out the competing explanations? Like, you've got it there then, and how do you like sift through before you're going to come up with your own plan of what happened?
We did. I mean, it was like a jigsaw, Tetris, whatever, because I had the elements, and I just wanted to make sure everything flowed logically, that as the reader experienced this, they had the information they needed already to digest it, but not too much. You don't want to advance the thing and then come back. I mean, in general, our rule was chronology is our friend, as we told the story, and then try to balance just to make sure the logic held. So there was a bit of adjusting as I told it, and kind of unwove, sort of peeled back the layers of the case. So
Yeah.
that was a sequencing challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, okay, when do we tell this? When do we let this out? When do we say whether he did this or that or the other thing? Because it all, blah, blah, blah. So once the ending comes to you, you're writing towards it and you're rewriting or whatever. So who sees your work first when you finish it? Where does it go to first?
First person is my wife. She's a great storyteller herself. She just has great instincts for that. And she also has great instincts if something's a little boring, or if she can't get it. And she, as are many, she's not an engineer, but there are elements of that need to come across in the story, need to work to a point where she can get it. So she was sort of a great test case for this. It's like she was the kind of reader that I wanted to be able to connect with in a way that they would understand it and enjoy it, and the pacing was good. And she's that way for all my books, really. And she's also, unsparing in both her praise and her criticism. So,
I can
but
picture that.
as we say, I'd rather hear it from her than the New York Times. And so she's first, and then, but I really don't show much of anything until I'm pretty complete with it. I'm not showing a lot of like early drafts. I'll do multiple drafts before it even goes to her. And then, my agent, my editor, at this point would start to see some early stuff.
So does writing get any easier as the years go on? I mean, this is like before. Is it you sit down and have any more confidence when you're sitting there like, wow, I can do this. It's going to get done. It's going to be great. Or is it still, I don't know. I'm not sure.
It's still the latter there. I wouldn't say it's easier. Easier is definitely not the word that comes to mind. Different though. I mean, I'm more experienced. I'm probably a little more resilient than I used to be. I've had some failures and some successes. And if you've only had a few failures, it's tough to keep the resilience going. But I think at this point, I also have a little bit more assurance that it's going to sell, which is somewhat motivating too. If you're like, oh, this may never get off the kitchen floor, then it's hard to keep going too. So I guess in that sense, I probably have a little bit more resolve to keep going. But easier is definitely not the word I would use.
No, and no one says it's easier. No one ever says that they feel like at the end, like it's going to happen, like it's going to finish and it's going to be done at some point. Because at some point it's like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, I don't even get it. And I don't know what I'm going to sit down and write tomorrow. And then there's this moment that it just clicks and it's like, I got it. But there's a lot of uncertainty, I hear, along the way to that moment.
It really is. I think even more so with fiction in that way. With nonfiction, if you've got one out that's okay, and then you've got another good idea, you might be in good shape. The fiction idea is like you can have a good idea, but it doesn't actually exist yet. It's still just an idea. So it's hard to execute on that. Whereas I think with nonfiction, if you've hooked into a good story, the material is there already. You've just got to do it. So.
And you're also hoping nobody else does it, because
there is that
fear, the fear of, is somebody else going to do it? Does somebody else have this title? Is somebody else heading in this direction? So you're constantly looking like over your shoulder and you're looking at what's coming out and what's going on and how am I going to fit in? So you've got a book like, you've got The Wager. You've got these other books of like, adventurers out there right now. Okay, there's a market for people looking at kinds of things like this. Because at the time, there were times where that wasn't of interest to people. An adventure story, it was a biography. It was just this, it was that. Bigger story. And it's like, I'm looking over my shoulder, hope nobody finds him too. Who else is looking at this research? Tell me.
Yeah. I'm very cagey about talking about what I'm working on. There's only a couple people who I'm kicking around a few ideas, but only a couple people know what they are.
There. So was this always the title? Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel?
It was not. In fact, almost the entire time it was not the title. Actually, most of the time we didn't have a title. We just had a bunch of working titles that we knew were only placeholders. We were not sold on them. And then Peter, who you mentioned well, is a terrific guy. He and I were like, you know what? We're just going to have a bottle of wine and we're going to solve this title thing one night. And one day then I came up with this title, Engines and Empires. And he loved it and I loved it. And we didn't even have the wine. It was just like, it happened. And we're like, all right, we got it. So that's it for like a couple months. And then Peter is in the internal SNS meeting, and Jonathan Karp, the CEO of Simon Schuster's in there too, and they're presenting to the sales team a number of books, not just mine, but mine comes up. And so Peter tells all about the book, and everyone's excited, and Karp's excited. It's like, this sounds really great and wonderful, but the title's wrong. And so I was out in California at a book festival at the time, and I'm at the airport coming home, and Peter calls. He's like, hey, the sales presentation was great. Everybody really loves the book. You got a lot of support from the sales team, the marketing team's up for it. But the title, we got to talk about the title. I'm like, the title? Like, we're like in the 11th hour. You want to change the title now? We'd already sent out galley. I had early, like, phase 1 galleys, like the Kinko's looking things with Engines and Empires on it. So we'd already printed galleys. I'm like, we're changing the title. And he said, well, look, the sales team and Jonathan Karp were kind of unanimous. Like, it's a bit of a mystery. So we got this Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes thing happening. Maybe mystery can be in there, and we really think Diesel's name should be in there. So Engines and Empires, like, that could kind of be about anything. And so in the end, I was like, well, I'm not going to get in the way of carp and the sales team. If that's what they want, they can have it. And so we changed, but it was very late in the game.
Really, I love that they're original arcs, that those are like collector's items at this point. And what I love about Jonathan, there are a lot of things I love about Jonathan, but Jonathan is one of those people that sits in a meeting and hears about a lot of things, but has opinions. And there was a book a couple of months ago that people were trying to figure out what to do. And they said, just give it to Jonathan to figure out the title, because he will read and he will see like what to do. And there's so many things along the way. He just feels passionately about the book, the book experience besides the business of publishing. And I love that, because I can just picture, okay, now we're going to think about it. Yeah, let's go back to the drawing board. But you still feel confidence because we'll come up with it. We'll figure it out,
Yeah.
I felt that. So the audio has Scott Brick as the brilliant narrator. I mean, like, amazing. And I listened to about half the book, and it was in the car. And I said, I really want to read this, and I can't read while I drive. So let's do this. His voice is just mesmerizing, and the way he's, going through everything. Did you request him as a narrator, or did this just happen, or what's the story there?
I did. Well, this is yet another funny. You're hitting all the funny stories. I haven't even told this one, but so this is the first time. You normally get on the book tour after a while. You just pull the string on your back, and you're like, wow, here's this thing.
I like to go for what you haven't heard.
This has not been told. So as you mentioned, I do that show dedicated where I talk to top authors and I fix a drink. And I thought it'd be interesting to have an audiobook narrator on there to let listeners know that side of the business and how he does it. And audio is such a growing segment of the market too. And he's like the king. I don't know, their form of the Oscars is the Audie. So if you do a great thing, you win the Audie. He's one of dozens and dozens of these Audies. And he reads great books of authors that I like too. So he came on and we did a nice show. And he, after we finished our on-air part, he's like, what are you up to? I'm like, oh, I got this book, whatever. Just tell me about it. He's like, that sounds fantastic. He's like, have you picked a reader? I'm like, no. I'm like, would you consider? He's like, sure. So it literally happened, we'd already had a couple drinks too. I think he chose like old fashions or something. We're drinking old fashions during the show. So over a few old fashions and a Sirius XM show, he then was like, send it to me, I'll do it. So I went back to Simon & Schuster. I think I want Scott Brick to do this. And they're like, he's really hard to get. He might be expensive. Just take these guys we sent to you. I'm like, would you please just send it to Scott Brick also and see what he says? And they're like, okay. And so they did. And he's, of course, said yes and did it. And it worked out. So it was great.
No, it's really, really good, because I love that his voice is so like you feel like you're being told a story, which of course is what he's doing, but it's also keeping you to keep going. Like you want to drive around the block one more time, because he's elicited that kind of, and then this is what happened. And you're like, okay, I'll keep going. I'm not going to stop now. And so many people, audio rights used to be like your rights to Finland. It didn't really amount to much money. And now all of a sudden, when you get your numbers, it's the print, the E, and the audio. And I've never been into E. I just can't, I think it's because I'm on a screen all day long, and I just that's not relaxing to me. So it's print, and then it was audio for a while when I was going into the city, because you'd have these long stretches of time. And there's a very funny story. We stopped going to the office because it was March of 2020, and we went in again to move some stuff out in May of 2020, and the same CD was in the car. And my son turns around, he goes, oh my God, they're still there. And it was like 2 months later, because you feel like their lives should have progressed as much as yours did. And it just didn't. It just didn't. So how did the podcast come about? How did this, like, you love authors, I know that.
Before I was a writer, I was in business, and I ran a small security firm. And I had investors, we're a private company. We had investors and customers and my executive team. And I was always in meetings, and it was a social aspect that I enjoyed. And then when I and I was also a part of this organization called YPO, Young Presidents Organization, which had this element to it called Forum, where once a month you'd meet with other CEOs and you'd have a dinner and talk about the challenges, work-life balance and things like that. So when I became a writer, went to, standstill on those kinds of things. It was very solitary. I wasn't interacting with other groups in a professional way. And then over a couple of years, I was fortunate to meet Nelson DeMille early in my writing career at a book festival, and he and I became good friends, and he's sort of a mentor to me because I have admired him for many years before I even started writing. And then a number of other writers. And, I was living in New York at that time, which is convenient to meet other writers. And so I tried to recreate that forum element of YPO with writers. and said, look, and I said, well, let's have a hook around it. Let's make it a book club. So we'll at least, instead of just getting together and drinking, we'll review a book of someone dead. We won't do living authors. And so I started a book club that would meet at my house like every month or two, and had some really terrific writers in it. Nelson was one, Amor Tolles, Lee Child, and Harlan Coben, and Joe Cannon, and other folks. And we had this great time. And so years later, I've left New York. And the book club has sort of disbanded a little bit because I'm not there, and people are, just sort of COVID, really, like the end of COVID, it kind of was the end of a lot of things, including my living in New York City. But I was talking to a friend at SiriusXM, and I was going to try to put it together for iHeart. And I was like, because it was like, this should be a podcast. Like, just have these guys on. People want to hear those conversations. Like, you're sitting in a bar with another writer. What do you guys talk about? And it's like, well, issues with agents and producers and book to film rights and whatever, all sorts of challenges. And but the friend of SiriusXM was like, well, don't send it to iHeart. Like, we would want to do this. I'm like, are you sure? Like, so anyway, I sort of programmed out what the show was, included the drinking element, because that was what was happening when I had the book club. We'd just have wine and drinks and things like that and talk. And yeah, just put it into like a one-on-one format instead of 10, although I might have some ensemble episodes, maybe like a Father's Day book recommendations episode or something like that. But yeah, it's been great. So I started out with a friend. Like, some of the first guests were Nelson and Lee, who are friends. And then others, people that Jennifer Egan was on early, and she and I had done an event together years ago. And then others were people I'd never met before, like Marlon James or Omar Epps or David Duchovny, so it was fun.
It's just fun because you get to hear what they're thinking about, their take on the business. Like Nelson, who's been in the business forever. And then Lee, who's now living, I still can't believe, on a ranch in Wyoming. I mean, I still cannot even, I went to, I guess it was CBS Sunday Morning or something with he and his brother walking around with the cowboy hats on. And I was like,
yeah,
we're going to buy this town and we're going to do this. And you just think about years ago when you were in book club with him, would you ever have said, and you're going to move to Wyoming and you're going to have a ranch? It's,
like, that's something Reacher could do, I suppose. So I can't totally put it past him. But I remember when Lee walked in, he was someone that Joe Cannon knew Lee. So Joe brought Lee into the book club. So I had never met him before the first time he showed up. And in walks this really tall guy with like a leather bomber jacket and jeans. And he's got a casual coolness. And it would have been immediate. If anyone walking in the room didn't know anyone, they just knew like the titles that were written, they would have said, that's the guy writing Reacher, for sure.
Yeah. He's really funny too. He's at a conference one time and he's being honored, and they had him on a number of panels. And it's like, 1 minute before the panel is going to start, right? And he comes like, like laconically walking in. And he turns around and goes, is this one about place or character? Like, which one am I doing? Because he's just going to sit down and nail it, like as he sits down. But it was like, place or character on this one. I said, I love this guy because he's got it inside of him, but he doesn't, let's say, it doesn't consume him. Yeah, that's what I just feel like. It doesn't consume him, what he does. It's a thing that he does, but he's a bigger person than that. I just
totally.
But there's so much
incredibly
fun.
Smart too. Like he's a real historian. He's just a very curious, smart guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And living in Wyoming now. And I said, getting back and forth. And he said, there are just certain things that you just don't think about anymore because it's just gonna be harder to do and harder to get. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So the cocktail of choice for you would be what?
Rye Manhattan Up.
Rye Manhattan Up. There you go. There you go. So, it did not escape me in this book that when Diesel was in the States, there was a hound dog cocktail that was made with bourbon, ginger, lemon, peach, and mint. So have you mixed that one up at all? Have you been asked to do that? I have
not. You know what? You might inspire me to go do that soon, though. It does sound pretty. Yeah, that was at the Adolphus Busch St. Louis event.
Yeah.
And I'll have to try one. Hound dog cocktail.
Hound dog cocktail. But I was just, because it was this, but that's what I loved about the book, were those little tiny details that you could just see the room. You could feel the room by what was going on and seeing that. So now Trophy Son, I think we said, came out about 6 years ago. I don't want to wait that long for another book from you. If you're going to do fiction, nonfiction, just give me a genre that might be next. Maybe.
Well, for this next one, I am almost certainly to stick with nonfiction.
Very good. Very good. You're going to explore something else. Let's see what other mystery is out there that you're going to trip upon,
Yeah, I think there are a lot.
And it's really interesting that it starts with something that you were just doing with the engine on the boat. It just starts with that. And it starts with this what I love about authors is the natural curiosity, because the curiosity is what really makes the story come and flow. And then telling it in a way that people are going to walk away and go, I learned something from this. I got it. I really got it. Doug, it was so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, Carol, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and see, and people today, we uncovered some things he hasn't talked about before. That's a big deal. To our viewers, look forward to seeing you next time on Book Reporter Talks to. Remember, you can find us on YouTube on the Book Report Network channel, or podcast wherever you listen to Book Reporter Talks to. Thanks so much, everybody.